Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 977th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the huge pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation with Alva Noë and Jonathan T.D. Neal. Alva Noë is professor of philosophy and chair of the Department of Philosophy at UC Berkeley. His books include Action and Perception, Out of Our Heads, Why You Are Not Your Brain, and Other Lessons from the Biology of Consciousness, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature, and most recently, The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us Who We Are. Noë is a past recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and also the Judd-Hume Prize in Advanced Visual Studies. Jonathan T.D. Neal was editor of the Held Essays on Visual Art for the Brooklyn Rail from 2011 to 2015. Currently, he's co-editor of Inversion Art, a startup that provides investment strategy and management services to visual artists. It is such a treat to have you both in the NSE Zoom room today, and thanks everyone who's tuning in. And I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Jonathan, to get us started.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you to everybody at the Rail. And thank you most of all to Alva for agreeing to this conversation and joining me here. It's good to see you again after many years. And primarily also, thank you very much for this wonderful book that you've put out into the world just recently, The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. By way of beginning, I think we do a little level setting because it can't be confident that everybody who's joining us today has read the book. So we'll need to give them a little bit of a précis about what they can expect. So to start it off, I want to just begin by asking, not to begin to say, Alva, what's your book about? But to put it this way, that The Entanglement, the book, is, among other things, a book about aesthetics. In some ways, you could think about it as an aesthetic theory or an updating of aesthetic theory for today. And so, by way of introduction, if you wouldn't mind, what is your understanding of aesthetics in the context of the book, and how is it necessary for understanding this concept or understanding what the entanglement is for you?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation, and so pleased that there's so many. The book is actually it's my seventh book, and it's the first book I've written that I don't understand. By which I mean I try to put my finger on certain phenomena in the book, and the phenomena themselves are kind of shifting spaces for conversation and investigation and research. And every time I present the work, every time I think about it more, the ground shifts underneath me. That's just to say that there's a lot that I want to try to share with you. And thank you, Jonathan, for putting your finger on the notion of the aesthetic, which in a way is the core notion. A lot of times when people understand aesthetic, they think it has something to do with how we like things or our preferences. A car might be a really good automobile, but you don't like the way it looks. So it's good functionally, but aesthetically, it's no good. And then in more artistic circles, we think of aesthetics as having to do with beauty or with the sublime or with originality or profundity or greatness or genius, right? There's all these questions. So there's the artwork we evaluated and tried to decide its aesthetic significance or respond to it at the level of its aesthetic significance. I have a very different way of thinking about what the aesthetic means, that starts off from the appreciation that even just seeing an artwork, bringing it into focus, standing in relationship to it is challenging. In fact, all perception, I think, is much, much harder than we think. Most of our lives, we're sort of skidding along, governed by habit and stereotype and task. And so our experience is just neglected by us as we engage the thing we need to engage with or deal with. And so we fail to realize how much work we ourselves are doing, as it were, behind the scenes to bring the world into focus. So for me, the term aesthetic refers to that work we need to do to move from not seeing to seeing, or from perceiving to perceiving differently. That's work we typically do together. We typically do in a social setting against a cultural background, drawing on the resources that are available to us in a shared environment. When I encounter somebody who is sexually or racially or politically or culturally other from me, I may not even be able to see them. I may not even be able to notice that I don't see them. I may be indifferent as a result. The opportunity to bring that which is there in front of me, in this case, I'm imagining another person, into focus for consciousness, that is the work of consciousness, and that's the work of aesthetics. Now, what does that have to do with art? Well, I think art, and not only art, I think also philosophy, but in a very different way, is an aesthetic discipline, if you like, or an aesthetic practice. Works of art are, if you like, opportunities not to be able to see. They're opportunities not to know what the thing in front of you is, not to be able to rely on habit or task or the self-evidence of a caption to simply know what you see. The work of art says, look at me again, try to figure out what I am. And in effect, and I'm coming to an end now, I noticed you wanted to jump in, but let me just round out this thought. What the work of art does is give you an opportunity to explore what I'm calling the aesthetic by, in effect, giving you an opportunity through resistance to let yourself catch yourself in the act of achieving perceptual consciousness of the world around us. And I'm saying perceptual, but it operates in every modality of our life, affective, emotional, as well as in terms of understanding. So I see the aesthetic as the primary category, art as the secondary category. That is, art is, if you like, a practice for studying the aesthetic or for learning about the aesthetic, which in effect is a way of studying and learning about ourselves.
Right. I think that's a good entry into the question that I was going to jump in to ask. The first handful of chapters in the book treat art primarily as an example, visual art. You have a chapter that's on writing and a chapter that's on dance or choreography, or I think more broadly moves into a sense of embodiment in general. And so these provide kind of three sort of disciplines or activities or areas of human engagement that may be sort of subsets or areas of the aesthetic that help you develop what this idea of the aesthetic is that you are marshaling. And what I found interesting is that in each of those, there's a kind of sense that, as you just mentioned, that this is about a kind of exploration of the self, right? A kind of exploration of who we are, what we are, and of human being that makes art primordial in a sense. It's like as if our inscriptions, our our attempt to represent ourselves through graphic means, through symbolic means, and even through physical and body means are the kind of initial or priority categories for us, or priority ways of being for us. And I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it. And I want to ask you sort of one, specifically with regards to writing. There's a footnote in the book that points to this, but it may be something that's more familiar to people of our generation that, in the 1990s, there was a lot of interest in Jacques Derrida and the sort of primacy of text over spoken word or speech. And you kind of hint at that. And there's a piece of that that's happening in your book, and specifically in the chapter on writing. And so by way of talking about this sort of the priority of the written and the priority of the representational, I wonder if you might speak a little bit about, what, if any, relationship there is to Derrida's work, but also this larger sense of what it means to think about ourselves as being written before we are spoken, or represented before we are presented.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. Let me answer that in two parts, or maybe three parts. First, the general structure of the argument. Second, how it relates to writing. And third, how it relates specifically to Derrida. So I had a teacher once who said that any philosophy that can be put in a nutshell belongs there. So I don't want to put my philosophy in this book in a nutshell. But if there was a slogan that governs what I'm doing in the book, it's the idea that art and life are entangled. And the way I'm trying to articulate what that might mean, explore its implications. And one of the thoughts is that we make art out of life. By which I don't mean just the trivial fact that sometimes art is about life, like we make pictures of people. Not all art is representational in that way. What I mean is that we ourselves are organized, put together through habit, through culture, at the level of feeling, at the level of cognition, we're organized in all sorts of ways, and that's what we make art out of. We start with the ways we tend to think, the ways we tend to see, the ways we tend to feel, and that's the materials with which we make art. And then the next thought is that those things that we make, whether they're pictures or sentences or poems or choreographies, then stand there for us as pictures of ourselves, or pictures of us in a particular neighborhood of our lives, in a particular corner of our existence, and become sort of scores or stereotypes or models by which we further organize ourselves. So the dancer, even at a party, dances in a way that is inflected by different choreographic images that have been available to them over time. So the art loops down and changes the raw materials that it springs from. Art and life are entangled. So that you can no longer factor out, well, what was the natural bit and what was the artistic or cultural bit? No, through time, and I'm thinking this on a primordial timescale. I'm glad you use that word. It's not a word I actually use, but it's the right word for this context. We become made anew again and again and again. We're made anew through art. We ourselves become art products. We are by nature something of which the question of what our nature is can't really adequately be posed, because our nature is not fixed, because we continuously reorganize ourselves through what I'm calling art. Art for me is a reorganizational practice. That's what it is, finally. Now, one of the themes in the book, which is most interesting and subtle, and when I talk about not understanding things in the book, in a way, I feel like this is still an open domain that I haven't fully tapped out, if you will, is the relationship between art and technology. And this is relevant to your question because there's a straightforward sense in which writing is a technology. there's a sense in which making pictures is a technology. There's a sense in which language is a technology. And when you think about writing, language, or picture making as technologies, you're embedding them in our anthropologies. What do we use pictures for? What do we use writing to do? And one of the hallmarks, I think, of technology, one of its defining features, is that when we're in the space of technology, typically we take for granted or feel that we're entitled to take for granted standards or measures of success, standards or measures of adequacy. We don't have this sense of what the hell is that when we're looking at a picture of grandma in the family photo album. We don't have that sense when we look at the iPhone in our pockets. These things have a familiarity through the ways in which they're bound in things we do and things we use them for. They come with manuals, they come with captions, we just know what they are. And I think art starts when we can no longer have access to a user manual or a caption, when we no longer know what they are. Now, the interesting thing is that art and technology are entangled, because there's a space in which the one influences the other. We make art out of technology and all the habits, the social habits that technology involves. And then it loops down and changes the technology out of which it's made. So materially, you may not be able to distinguish a urinal from a sculpture. It's not a material difference. It's a conceptual difference or a logical difference. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off the thread. Or maybe we'll come back to it, but, oh, yes.
No. I think that's good. I'll still push you on the connection to Derrida, but I don't think it's super material. But I want to bring this up because you've used a term twice now that I think is important in the book, that it's going to be new to many readers, which is looping down, right? There's a sort of technical aspect to it, but it's something that you marshal in the book about the way that certain activities or certain artifacts sort of loop down as a way of illustrating this idea of the entanglement and the way that these various different, ways of being in our life worlds are entangled. So I'm curious if you could just, for the audience and for my sake as well, describe a little bit what you mean and where this idea of looping down comes from.
Actually, the term is originally due to Ian Hacking, who's a Canadian philosopher of science who actually died not that long ago. And he made the discovery, I think it's a discovery, it's such a beautiful idea, that the availability of concepts of ourselves gives us resources to be different. So if we have the concept of anorexia, we can also become anorexic. And if we have the concept of being gay, we can use that concept not just to categorize ourselves, but as a sort of an idea by which we can enact ourselves. And he called these looping concepts. They're not merely descriptive. They're sort of, in my terminology, they're enactive. Or in my terminology, they're kind of like scores that we can use to play ourselves. And I think this is a very, very crucial idea for thinking about questions of human identity. And so in a way in the book, I'm generalizing that. And I'm looking at the way in which, it's funny, I don't quite put it that way in the book, but in a way, what I'm doing is generalizing that idea and thinking about the ways in which the images, the models, the representations, the depictions that we construct of ourselves give us new resources for inhabiting what it is to be ourselves. An 8-year-old child dancing by herself in her bedroom to Billie Eilish, already in her movements, incorporates a whole history of dance. She's not thinking about that. She doesn't even consciously know about it. But it's available to her. And it helps her answer the question, what am I doing? What is dancing? What does dancing look like? What does it feel like to be doing this thing called dancing? Another source for me of this idea is really a kind of a moment when I thought, aha, this is important, was a book that was written in the late 70s by Anne Hollander, who I'm sure is a person that many people in your audience will know of. She was a very prominent person in New York. Her book, Seeing Through Clothes, explores the way in which, in the history of Western art, representations of the clothed body alter what it is to be a clothed body. That is to say, what it is to be a person presenting him or her or themselves to others.
Right.
And so in this way, these things we make become templates by which we can enact ourselves. And I think this goes on to go back to your question about language. This is one of the things that interests me in the point about writing, because for those of us who live in what the linguist Roy Harris called a scriptural universe, we don't just talk. We have available to us, ready to hand, a whole regimen and ideology about what it is we're doing when we're talking, which is enshrined in writing. And writing is not just something which is there. There is nothing that we drill in a more brutal and insistent and non-liberal way. I mean, think about it. Every single child in our society is made to master this particular cultural skill, which we call writing. And what that skill is a way, what it is to learn to write is to learn to think about what we are doing when we're talking in the shadow cast by writing. What I am doing is combining words. Words have spellings. Well, there's another way of thinking about language. Language is like movement. Language is in the throat, it's in the breast, it's in the heart, it's in movement. How do we write that down? There isn't one way to write it down because it's not one thing. It's not, I mean, this is a controversial claim, but there's not only one articulation, there's multiple articulations. So the very way that we live our own language as something writable is for us to be inside a kind of
Style.
yeah, yeah. And but this, for me, this connects to the primordial poem, because people say, I'm sure members of this audience will think very, very reasonably, but there's language outside of grammar. There's language outside of literacy. In fact, most of the languages spoken by most people through unrecorded time have had no ways of writing down what they do, and that's true today as well. It's a small subset of our linguistic lives which is actually organized in this way by regimens of writing. So one of the things I argue in the book is that actually there's a way in which that isn't true. While it is true that the particular extant forms of technological practice that we have called writing are datable human inventions, the negotiation, the need, the problem which writing is applied to solve pre-exists writing. And it's the problem of getting clear about this complicated thing we're doing when we're just simply living together. So if you like, wherever there is speech, and whenever there was speech, there was misunderstanding, or at least its possibility. And thus there was the need for you and me, I should say, to make our interaction itself an object of our reflection. So whether we actually use marks on paper or stone or sand to represent that communication between us, We needed to take up a kind of meta-linguistic standpoint. The meta perspective is internal. It belongs to the first order perspective. It is entangled with the first order. Language is entangled with the problem of language, which is to say it's entangled with philosophy. Mm. And so my argument in the book is that writing begins in philosophy, and philosophy begins with communication. And philosophy and art, for me, are kind of interchangeable terms in the book. So now, is that Derrida's view or not? Actually, I'm not enough of an expert on Derrida to say. I think there's interesting ways in which it's different from Derrida's view, as far as I understand it. But I might also be reinventing his wheel. I'm not sure, honestly.
So, as you were speaking about that, I was thinking about a very sort of substantial portion of the book where, if we think about visual representations of art or language or the choreographies of embodiment, and actually just then when you were speaking, I was sort of put in mind of, like, two individuals needing to sort of negotiate some sort of relationship to one another verbally without written down, but in order to come to some, in order to be organized in that negotiation, whatever it might be about, you adopt certain, let's say, rules, right? Or they adopt a certain kind of ordering of themselves or an organization of themselves in order to come to a resolution or to come to a solution to whatever that sort of challenge might be. I was put in mind towards the end of the book where you invoke the kind of the language game of the law, right? And we have these very elaborate ways of behaving and acting in a court of law and through legal discourse that, outside of that vocation, would seem otherwise totally insane to, if that was the world that you were trying to inhabit outside of the courtroom. But that is a way of thinking about being written or being inscribed or being represented, even if it's a purely sort of oral, enacted environment. Like choreography already assumes a kind of gap between the habitual lived and the need to reflect on what that habit is. And so is it that gap, or is it that sort of beat in between the action and the perspective on the action, which is this sort of space of the aesthetic that we're talking about, and the sort of the idea of being written or being painted or being choreographed, that is this kind of, here I hesitate, but what I want to think of is like, it's that idea of negation, right? It's like you have this way of stepping back from or needing to sort of create a pause in between the doing and the thought of what it is that's being done.
Let me try to speak to what you're pointing at like this. There's so many different inspirations for me that feed into the thoughts that go into the book. And one of them were conversations I had over many, many years with Hubert Dreyfus, who some of you will know was a great American interpreter of Heidegger. And for Dreyfus and Dreyfus's Heidegger, it was extremely important that we could make a sharp distinction between what he called the engaged attitude, when one is unreflectively involved with one's living, and the reflective or detached attitude, when one is making one's engagements a problem for you. So I'm hammering. This is Heidegger's example. I'm building my house. All of a sudden, the head of the hammer flies off. And suddenly this hammer, which was present for me, it was ready to hand as an implement, as a tool. Now all of a sudden it becomes a problem for me, an object that I need to think about. And I can, and for Dreyfus, there was the primordial engagement, and then there was a kind of alienation from the engagement, which comes and requires reflection. So there's a way in which a reflection was this kind of So like the great shortstop is the shortstop who's completely operating at the level of automaticity. The great chess player is the chess player who doesn't need to think to act, just the chessboard acts them. And one way to summarize what my book is arguing against is that view.
Right.
In a way, I want to say these are entangled.
Right.
The detachment and reflection are always coupled to each other. Engagement always contains within itself the lived expected possibility of the need for reflection. I don't stop building the house when the hammer breaks. That's just another modality of my building work. And similarly, you and I don't stop communicating when you use words that I don't understand. My misunderstanding you becomes an opportunity for us to create new meaning together, new pathways forward. And again, that second order is always contained in the first order. The philosophy, the art, the reflection, the image, the model, the detachment is actually something that is always already present at the first order. So
So is that,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but the figure of the shortstop is a wonderful one to pause with for a moment, because I also think of, is it that when the shortstop, or I think of the pitcher, all of a sudden, when they are unable to execute the most common throw to first, or when the pitches start going wild, and the argument is that they're overthinking it, or somehow they're like they become too reflective. Your argument is like, what they've in fact done is they've disentangled, right? Like the entanglement between the reflective and the engaged is no longer operable. So that is like the source of the problem. They need to sort of not stop thinking and just engage, just move to one side or the other of those two ways of thinking about it. Like, in fact, what they need to do is recouple them and re-entangle the way that those things work together.
that's a really nice point. I hadn't quite put it that way, but that kind of follows from the way I'm thinking about it. I mean, the question of how you help a person get through that crisis, the yips in
Right.
baseball, how you
Yes.
help them,
Yes.
how you help them get over that
Yes.
is, I mean, careers have ended. Many careers have ended, and it's not just baseball. I mean, you know,
Yes.
what is sexual dysfunction? I mean, all these different kinds of things that people deal with. It's when they somehow can no longer just spontaneously be. And I would never want to say that that isn't a real issue for us in our relationships, in our friendships, in our creative work, in our athletic endeavors. But all I'm trying to, my point is to resist a certain kind of fantasy, as if because part of the problem is this: the intellect itself, talking as we are talking now, that's also a activity with which we can be engaged. We don't sit back like robots choosing each word. No, we get into the flow. That flow is the expression of our thoughtfulness, of our intelligence. The idea that anyway, the reason why this is important is because it it shows how there's a kind of opportunity for and presence for philosophy and art at every moment in our lives. It's always there. Um, and there's so many things that we can talk about in the book, but one thing I just want to mention is that one of the ideas I'm very critical of is some other thought that philosophy and art don't matter anymore. Cognitive science, neuroscience, brain science, that tells us what it is to be a human being. Um, and and actually, this goes back. You asked something I didn't quite answer about how the aesthetic enters into the question of this gap between the first order and the second order. And one of the arguments I want to make is that we really are aesthetic problems to ourselves, by which I mean, and remember how I use the word aesthetic. For me, the aesthetic means the problem of of moving from not seeing to seeing. When we encounter ourselves, the very act of think for example right now about what is your visual experience like now, or what is your emotional experience right now. There isn't really just one way to answer that question. In a way, you have an interpretive problem. I mean, this is something psychoanalysis understands, I think. But you stand to yourself in something like the way you stand to a painting on the wall in a gallery. There's a lot for you to think about, a lot for you to wonder about. And the very act of thinking about it and wondering changes you, which goes back to this idea I mentioned at the outset that we're not fixed, we're always changing. And that has implications. How can we look for the neural correlates of visual consciousness if visual consciousness isn't stable, if it isn't fixed, if it isn't the kind of thing that could correspond one to a state of my brain now?
Mm-hmm. So I get that what you just described is a way of understanding sort of what the book is positioned against. And I think, when I was reading it, I sort of began to understand, especially in the later chapters, as a kind of an argument against a kind of reductionism that seeks to kind of pull apart everything into its constituent pieces and to try and explain the world based on that. And I think that in my mind, there's a sort of argument that goes back to the sort of priority of physics with all the various different disciplines built up on top of it, and then arguments by various different people that say, well, listen, there's real differences between sort of certain fundamental ideas and then what you get in sort of more complex or let's say differently organized disciplines and way of understanding what's happening in there. So I'm curious about, in your mind, it's not just an argument against reductionism, because I would think that you accept that there is value even in, let's say, the neuroaesthetic or cognitive neuroscience activities of research and discovery and understanding something about the way cognition works or the way that perception works, even at some basic levels, because those things can then be brought up into our aesthetic understanding, right? And again, not aesthetic in terms of how things look, but as ways, as this sort of the body of knowledge that is available to us or that is out there, out of which we can begin to, pause and think about how it shapes us as human beings. But I'm curious that, how it's not a call to sort of stop let's say, the neuroaesthetic program, right? But if this book is a call to, say, other philosophers working in these fields, what is it a call to them to do differently in their research programs or in the kind of activities that they are involved in?
That's a hard question you've asked. The I think that human consciousness, perception, memory, personality, desire, anxiety, thought are intrinsically aesthetic problems. And that until cognitive science comes clean about that, then there's always going to be something fraudulent in cognitive science. There's always going to be something distorting. It's always going to be a person in a white coat telling them that they know what you are and trying to encourage you not to say, but wait a second, I know I'm something else too, which you're always entitled to do. And it sounds like a general anti-science claim that I'm making, but it's not. I think it's pointing out that there's a politics about what's going on in this current wave. You know, in the 30s, Edmund Husserl wrote a book called The Crisis of the European Sciences. And he made this kind of wild and crazy claim in that book, which is that the problems then facing Europe, and he wrote it in the 30s, as a Jewish professor who'd been fired from his job and forced into exile for being Jewish, and at a time when Nazi Germany was on the roll and war was facing Europe and the entire world. He made this kind of crazy claim that the problems facing Europe and the world were philosophical, and that they fundamentally had to do with philosophy's relation to science or science's relationship to philosophy. And his anxiety, his worry was not that science was too insufficient or too weak. It was that it was too strong, as if the particular kinds of models of precision and certainty and definiteness of positive knowledge that science and, say, physics can provide really gives the standard the only kind of knowledge that there is. And Husserl's claim was that kind of position has nothing to say about human life. It has nothing to say about values. It has nothing to say about consciousness and subjectivity. It has nothing to say even about rationality itself and how rationality can be for us a defining way of learning about and understanding the world. It doesn't shut off philosophy, but if it takes all the oxygen out of the room and deprives philosophy of a chance to live, it does violence against us. Now, how that leads to the Second World War is a topic for another day, but I think something like that is going on today. When you look at what the social sciences or the cognitive sciences offer us as models or images of what it is to be a human being, we have a very, very limited menu. Either you're a computer, or you're a bag of cells, or you're a network of genes. And none of those pictures of ourselves can do adequate justice to what we actually know our lives to be. I think that is not a gap that science can make up. And it's a kind of an imperialism of science that leads us to think that it will. That's the gap that philosophy and art make up. So what I definitely don't want to say stop funding neuroscience. I don't want to say that. If anybody's listening, that's not my point. My point is, don't for a second think that the work you're doing in those neuroscience labs is independent of or prior to fundamental work in philosophy and in the humanities and in the arts more generally. So there is a kind of very basic message there that I want to communicate, not just for the importance, but for the necessity and the ineliminableness of art and philosophy.
This is sort of the flip side of that, and I want to give this question a kind of tagline, which is like something Nietzschean. This way it comes. Towards the end of the book, you make this argument about the seepage problem, which I think is roughly defined as when, the aesthetic approach seeps into science, and for some people, this calls into question the truth claims of science itself, like the truth claims of the natural sciences, which may be the sort of reverse image of what you just described in terms of the natural sciences disregarding philosophy and art. This would be the sort of aesthetic disregard for the achievements and the truth claims of natural science. Now, I understand for you, it's not a problem because you look at these, your argument, I think, here is that these things are ultimately entangled, right? That the aesthetic, that art is entangled with science, that art and philosophy are entangled with the sciences. And so these things belong fundamentally together in order to make them whole. But when you're making this point, you sort of illustrate it with this scene. Again, this goes back to that idea of playing these language games, that if we played the language game of law, we played the language game of science out in everyday life, and you write, and if I get this quote right, if one were to try to live by the rules of science or the law in ordinary family or work life, or for that matter, in the back office studios and labs of scientists themselves, one would rightly be viewed as foolish and insensitive, irrational, and unreasonable. And so we keep our eyes on the boundary. This is me now. But what I want to ask is, sometimes isn't it just the individual who seems to be insensitive, irrational, unreasonable, who we look to or often as the source of some of the greatest insights, because maybe somehow they are at odds with ordinary reasonableness and rationality? And if we take that, if that is the individual who is in some sense inhabiting this aesthetic that you've defined, someone who is really seen differently, seen otherwise, who sees something that everybody else doesn't see, that would, there's a way there's some individuals who are almost sort of what I would say like ultra aesthetic or extra aesthetic.
Mhm.
And then doesn't that point in some sense to an idea that like a lot of the rest of the work that we are doing, that in a ways like we are not aesthetic enough, and that most of our art and most of our philosophy is not pushing as far as it should be going, in the kind of, let's say, the vocational work of art and philosophy that we would be doing in our kind of workaday lives? Is there an argument here in the other direction that like we need to be more, or the artist broadly defined, the philosopher broadly defined, or artistic work or philosophic work broadly defined needs to be more radical than it currently is, or sort of more aesthetic than it currently is?
I love this line of thought. I think this is. I think. I think the answer is yes and no. Because everything in my book is about putting something in place and then taking it back, saying something and then undoing and doing it. So right now, I've been talking about the difference between science and philosophy. And I think there are differences. One of the differences that science has clear accepted criteria for dispute, for adjudicating dispute. It's just not true in philosophy. I mean, it might be locally true. It might be true in this philosophy department or in this particular community, but it's of the very nature of philosophy that its problems elude that kind of disposition. Um, uh, we don't read Kant or Plato or Hegel or Nietzsche or Wittgenstein or Derrida or me because we agree with us, because we're right, because we think they're right. We read them because these are useful playing fields for us to reorganize our thinking about the questions that are at play. That's just not the same in science. So science and philosophy, two different things, just as on my view, art and technology, two different things. But they are entangled. There is not, the boundary between them is in dispute. And it's in dispute internal. It's just like, and it's always being negotiated from the inside. So 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 that's one point. A second point related is that every good scientist also needs to be a philosopher, and every good philosopher also needs to be a scientist. It's not as though philosophers are immune or indifferent to what we can learn factually about the world through studying it. And it's not as though scientists are indifferent or immune to fundamental conceptual questions about what they're doing. I mean, when physicists reflect in deep ways about time or about origins or about everything versus nothing, or about the beginnings of the universe, they are in a philosophical playing ground, whether they choose to label it that way or not. So the academic labels, philosophy department, physics department, have nothing to do with the distribution of philosophy and science, right? So I think these things are entangled, and they're productively entangled. And that means at the limits, they become one, which is historically what they always were. Newton was a natural philosopher. Um, and this, this is, it's hard to discuss this without getting into the details, because obviously, anthropologically speaking, the world of the physicist, the formation of the physicist, the education of the physicist, the kind of tools that the physicists use, the mathematics that the physicists use, are different from the formation, the training, the tools of the philosopher. But those, in a way, I think, are superficial. Yes, I would say to you, philosophy is too conservative at the moment. It's the tendency for philosophy to model itself too closely to the sciences. When I submit a journal to a philosophy article, I need to write an abstract, as if you can abstract a philosophy article. The thing is, you can abstract a physics article because the physics article has a bottom line. But a philosophy article doesn't have a bottom line. Well, that's like saying that a jazz composition has a bottom line. No, a jazz composition needs to be played, and a philosophical text or a philosophical argument needs to be performed by the reader. And when they perform it, they make it something new. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like art. That's what we do when you go to the gallery and you stand before the work. You don't just perceive it optically. You have to engage it. You have to play it. You have to throw yourself at it and see what happens when you do. You have to turn it on by turning yourself on. And in doing that, you change yourself. And that's what philosophy does too. Now, there's lots of philosophers, maybe in the audience even, who would disagree with me because they are more comfortable assimilating philosophy to science. But I think that it's actually interesting. As I'm talking, I'm realizing that this theme of philosophy and its relation to science, in a way, is really one of the central preoccupations of philosophy since the scientific revolution.
Right.
How to understand this activity, and it's important. Let me just say this: I feel like have a tendency to go on too long, but the reason why it's important is we ask, what is the value? What is the value of this work that doesn't produce findings that are useful? This was Socrates' concern, or rather, it was Plato's concern when reflecting on the philosophical work of his teacher Socrates. A Socratic dialogue is a very simple form. Somebody says something, they make an assertion, and Socrates shows them that there are contradictions implicit in what they believe, and they don't know what they think they know. How can that be a thing of value, to simply be interrogated and shown to be caught up in self-contradiction? In the way that, finding a cure for COVID or, for malaria is a thing of value. How can that be a thing of value? Similarly, why is art valuable? We know why the iPhone is valuable. It's useful. It lets me call grandma. But why is the painting useful? What is its value? So I think this question of value is at the heart of philosophy in the last 200 years. And it's really what my book is about. I'm arguing that actually art and philosophy are the fundamental engines by which human beings become human beings. We are philosophical products. We are art products. And science is just a kind of a participant.
I want to ask one last question, and then I think we'll be ready to turn it over to our audience, who I'm sure has questions. But before we do that, as you were just speaking, I think for many people, the value of science or the value of technology has embedded within it the arrow of progress, right? And there is a kind of, I hesitate to use the word teleology, but there is at least part of it is a sense of kind of continued uncovering of discoveries or better understanding of the world, ourselves, etc. right? Correct or incorrect? And, I'm curious for you, the book makes these arguments about needing to sort of understand or embrace or, to keep in mind the kind of aesthetic problem or the work of the aesthetic, which is itself a kind of problem, a productive one. But there is a argument that this is the path towards a kind of better understanding of ourselves, that there is a kind of trajectory of progress. Is that a position or a read of that you would agree with? I don't think it's not made explicitly in the book, but I can't help but think that the argument is that the understanding that we have of ourselves today fails in some sense, right? We fail to inhabit a style, or we have certain kinds of ways of understanding ourselves that rely too heavily on reductionist approaches. And thus we have to reorganize ourselves in order to achieve a different access to the world. But there is some sort of implicit goal there, right? There is a sense of either greater understanding, greater knowledge, amelioration, what have you. And I'm curious if that is just in the background or if that's very much the foreground of your thinking.
What a beautiful and important question. In one sense, I think philosophy doesn't make progress if by that we think philosophy yields findings that can be then taken for granted as we move on to the next discovery, in precisely the way that physics or chemistry make findings. But philosophy, at the same time, is, I think, and art, are the work of freeing ourselves from the ways we're stuck being. We're like Gregor Samsa in Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and we wake up and we just find that we're cockroaches. We didn't choose it. We don't make ourselves. We don't choose our worlds. We don't choose our family. We don't choose our fears and impulses. We cope with them. And philosophy and art are ways that we cope with them, and in coping with them and in resisting them, emancipate ourselves from them. Not in the sense, I don't believe in a kind of state of ultimate freedom to which we might arrive, but rather we change and we live in history. We live in history as a species, we live in history as a community, and we live in history as individuals. I like to think about the way I'm better able to love the people in my life now than I was earlier. How I can be less full of conflict and strife in my personal being than I used to be. That is, I'm striving, maybe I'm deluded, but I've striven for a certain kind of personal growth or progress. And I think that's real. And if you liken philosophy to like the history of art, it's obviously progress in the sense that everything that happens is the basis for what happens next, and what happens next never could have happened if not for what happened before. It's deeply historical. Every style exists in a kind of mise en scène of other possible styles that are or ever could possibly be. On the other hand, there's no sort of external perspective from which one can or should speak of progress. We're just animals trying to cope. I'll end up with two thoughts. Two philosophers who inspire me on this point. One is Wittgenstein, one of whose glosses on philosophy is He said the shape or the form of a philosophical problem is we don't know our way around. We're lost. And so the work of philosophy is gaining orientation. And I think that's right if you add in addition the further thought that the landscape is always changing. So there's no such thing as definitive orientation once and for all. And the other philosopher who's very inspiring to me on this point is Husserl, who said that, once you notice possibilities of being different to the way you are, then those possibilities are always part of the horizon for you of what there is. So the work of philosophy changes, it reorients, it doesn't change the world, but it reorients ourselves to the world and thus changes the world because we then act and carry on differently. So finding our way about and reorientation, in a way, I think that's the aim of philosophy, that's the aim of aesthetics. And finally, that's the source of art's value, whatever other sources of value it may have.
Thank you, Alva. Amazing. Eleanor, I think we are ready to open it up to our audience.
Thank you so, so much, Alva and Jonathan, for a really, really brilliant and insightful conversation. We have so many questions from the audience that I'd love to get to now. So our first question today will be from Asani. And Asani, I'll give you the opportunity to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. First of all, thank you, Professor No, for a fascinating discussion. I just want to mention also, actually, you are supervising a research group that my daughter is part of, so I have a connection with you. So the question I have is in hearing this discussion, I was thinking actually the cognitive sciences, what the cognitive science is saying is maybe not that in conflict with what you're saying in the following sense, that what the neuroscientists would say is that at a very basic biological level, the brain is already modifying what we are seeing through our various sensory inputs. For example, in the natural world, there is no color, but the brain kind of modifies the inputs so that we see color, so to make the world more understandable. In the natural world, there is no continuous motion, but we observe as if motion is continuous. So in a sense, like there's this, there is art involved even at a very basic, fundamental biological level. I was wondering what you thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to meet you, and it's a beautiful point. What's interesting, and allow me to resist your point, that you take for granted what natural is. And the conception of the natural that you take for granted is the physicist's definition of what's natural, and indeed the Newton's definition of what's natural, where the world exists of corpuscles that act on us, giving rise to the colors inside of us, the so-called secondary qualities. If you were a biologist and you were interested in how species function in their ecological niche, then colors would be an absolutely crucial part of the story. The reason why there is camouflage, the reason why plants that are poisonous exhibit certain coloration, the ability of bees to pollinate depends on the ecological, natural reality of color. Now, you might say, yes, but that's already just appealing to other observers. The point is how we conceptualize the natural world and our place in it is itself always already the job for philosophy and can be the site of controversy. Note just one last thing that this physical picture has trouble with is we say the color is in us, it's not in the world, but we're just physical elements ourselves. We're just more atoms obeying more physical laws. So we don't really have a story about where those colors are in the end. And we've lost experience itself. Now, can we seriously believe that there's no such thing as conscious experience?
Thank you so much, Alva. And thank you so much for that question, Asani. That was really great. Our next question is from Jay, and I will ask on Jay's behalf. Jay writes, I'm curious about the possible limits of claiming entanglement. On the one hand, it's inevitable. On the other hand, its popularized meaning, quote, we're all star stuff, seems to give into romanticism and flattening of difference. I also am curious about if you've engaged with eco-criticism and discourses around the Anthropocene, especially related to understanding how indigenous theories have always been studying entanglement.
It's a nice question that I'd like to use as an opportunity to think more about the point of view that the speaker expresses. Jay, I use the word entanglement not to mean the physical. I don't mean sort of what Einstein meant. I don't mean that we're all star stuff. I mean that our lives are always including within them resistance to the way we find ourselves living. That there's a way in which, if you think of a person as kind of a structure of habits, in my writing, I have a kind of a technical notion of organized activity, which corresponds something to the level of habit. And I try to show how perception and action and movement can be modeled as organized activities. But one of the interesting things about human beings is that we're always also trying to resist being confined just by the ways in which we're organized. And I think I don't see that as a Western phenomenon or an indigenous phenomenon. I see it as a kind of way in which, actually, this is a delicate point. I want to try to put it right. I see it as an essential feature, an essential kind of normativity of the human condition. By normativity, I mean that we're always made to grapple with the conditions in which we find ourselves and find the way forward that feels right. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jay. Thank you so much. And thanks, Alva. Our next question is from Helen, and I will ask on Helen's behalf. Helen wrote, Barad argues a hybrid philosophy science to frame entanglement as relational, an inclusive discursive practice, similar to this idea of aesthetics as a doing, not a thing, in which ethnics, ontology, epistemology are inseparable. Does intersectional feminist thought factor into this approach to entanglement?
I think of myself as engaging with the very same issues that Barad and what you're calling intersectional feminist thought engages with. A central preoccupation of the book is trying to frame ways of understanding human identity, what it is to be a person, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be of one identity or another. We didn't talk about that in the discussion, but there are two chapters in the book, one called Fragile Bodies and one called Existential Style, that are directly engaged with that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
So you'll have to read those chapters to find out more. Thank you so much, Alva. And thanks, Helen. We've got a few more questions, Alva, if you'll have them. Our next question is from Vico. And Vico, I will give you a chance to unmute to ask.
Thank you. And I wonder if, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to John. Really, Jonathan, and really was really good questions. So I wondered about in the terms of, it was mentioned earlier that what we think pre-exists writing. So then I make the continuation of that thought, then what we think should also pre-exist art. And then if that is correct, then I was wondering then, is this an activity of remembering? Then if it is an activity of remembering, in the case of the artist, when he's making a work of art, then what is worth, or how does the artist know what is worth remembering? Or to what the artist inclines more to remember, let's say, better? Does it align with science, or does it align with social science? Or to what sort of a practice can the artist inclined to have this direct connection with the thought, or to remember that thought in a clearer or closer to be a clearer way? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vico. That's a curious and interesting question. I think I can only answer a piece of it. Why? I'm actually reminded a quote that there's a couple of different quotes from other authors that are very important to me in the book, and one of them is from James Baldwin, who said, this is actually a paraphrase. He said, "Art aims at uncovering the questions that have been hidden by the answers." Art aims at uncovering the questions that have been hidden by the answers. He might have said philosophy aims at uncovering the questions that have been hidden by the answers, but maybe he should have said art and philosophy aim at uncovering the questions. The point is that questions are hidden, but which questions, in a way, your question is asking? Which questions? Where do we need to do our work? Or to frame it as the passage from Wittgenstein that I shared with you would have it, where do we need to find ourselves? Where are we lost? What is it we need to remember? And those are problems for philosophy. Those are problems for art. You may work on questions that other people don't care about. That's a problem that you have to deal with as an artist or as a philosopher. On the other hand, you may be able to persuade people that the questions that concern you, that have been hidden by the answers, are just the ones that need uncovering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alva. Thank you, Vico, for that question. Our next question or comment is from Pamela. And Pamela, I'll give you a chance to unmute.
Hi, this is Pam. Thank you so much for taking my question and my comments. Thank you, Alva, so much. This is so thought-provoking. I've just finished reading Dan Thies's book on Notes on Complexity. And it seems to me that the notion that you have on entanglement has similarities, let's say, to this notion of complexity and entanglement between, this aha moment, this aesthetic idea that the change of thought, the change of thinking is worthy of investigation. And then that got me thinking about William Kentridge and his notion of mistranslation that is worthy of further exploration. of the translation of one thing to another and understanding a difference in cognition, a difference in perception. And I think that there's kind of this merging of scientific thought with perceptual thought that your notion of entanglement embraces. So if there's a question in there, I don't think it's more of a comment, but I so appreciate your thoughts on this, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you, Pam. It's so interesting how each of us is here drawing on where we are and what we did yesterday and the day before and what we're going to be doing in a half an hour. So these books are, or Kentridge as an artist is in your consciousness. So you're seeing connections. I'm very grateful to you for sharing them with me. I'll look into Notes on Complexity and William Kentridge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Pam, and thanks so much again, Alva. That will conclude our Q&A for today. And again, we're so grateful to Jonathan and Alva for the really illuminating dialogue today. And don't forget to get a copy of The Entanglement. There is a code for 30% off in the chat. It was just reposted, so please do order a copy of your very own of this great book. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions and for tuning in today. To conclude the program, I would like to hand it back over to Alva to give us a short reading. Thank you, Alva.
Thank you. Not a reading from my book, but I know that poetry is so important in the Brooklyn Rail community, and I was invited if I'd like to share a poem with you. But first, let me say thank you. It's for those of you who are authors, who are performers, or who are makers of one kind or another. There's nothing more gratifying than an audience. So I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful to Brooklyn Rail and especially Jonathan. Jonathan has been championing me, inviting me to do things and supporting me for years now, and I thank you very much. I'm really grateful, and it's the end of we've just come to the new year, and I hear everybody on the radio, everybody's talking about how bad a year 2023 was, and maybe we'll have a better year in 2024. And you know what? It's really true. 2023 sucked in so many ways. It was really such a painful, difficult year. I mentioned Husserl before. Husserl wrote this book, The Crisis of the European Sciences, in the 1930s, and we're really living in a time of immense crisis and anxiety. I won't list the countless crises and anxieties that really confront us, political and social and environmental. And gosh, I mean, it's a difficult moment. But one of the occasion for the poem I wanted to share is I think many people have the experience that I have, which is that in some ways we're backsliding. I feel like we're more today like Husserl's world of the Second World War than we were 30 years ago. You know, in the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, we were very far away from central 20th century, middle 20th century. It doesn't seem that far away now. We seem vulnerable in all the ways that Husserl was vulnerable. So the poem I wanted to share is by a man named, let me just get it out here, Jacob van Hoddes. And that was actually the pen name of Hans Davidson, who died in 1942. He was murdered by Nazis in Sobibor death camp in Poland. This poem is called The End of the World, and it was written in 1911. And the thing is, it's an expressionist work. It's funny and it's witty, but it's also deadly terrifying and exactly apt for our moment. It's very short. I'm going to read it first in German, and then I'm going to read it in English. So in German, Weltende. Dem Bürger fliegt vom Spitzenkopf der Hut. In allen Lüften hallt es wie Geschrei. Dachdecker stürzen ab und gehen entzwei. Und an den Küsten liest man, steigt die Flut. Der Sturm ist da, die wilden Meere hupfen an Land. Und dicke Dämme zu zerdrücken. Die meisten Menschen haben einen Schnupfen. Die Eisenbahnen fallen von den Brücken. Now here's my translation. End of the world. Hats are flying off the pointed heads of citizens. Screams reverberate in the drafts. Roofs collapse and split in two, and on the coasts, we read, the tides are rising. The storm is here, the wild seas are jumping up on land and shattering the dams. Most people have the sniffles. Trains are falling off bridges.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alva, for that reading. And just thanks again to Jonathan. It's been such a great afternoon and such a great dialogue, and amazing questions from the audience. Thank you all for your contributions. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our archive, where you'll be able to view this conversation shortly on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Please support our work through a link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow, join us at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with Michelle Handelman, Jill H. Cassad, and Ksenia M. Soboliva. And that will be on the occasion of Michelle's exhibition at Signs and Symbols Gallery in New York. And with that, you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Alva. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, Alva. Thank you, Jonathan.
Larry, thank you, Jonathan.
Ciao.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.